This is episode 9 with Eben Pagan. Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. Welcome back, gentlemen, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to someone who, aside from my parents, has had more of an impact on my life than anybody else. 12 years ago, you literally wouldn't have recognized me. I was extremely shy, especially when it came to dating. I had no self-confidence. I was frustrated at where my life was at and my results, specifically when it came to my business pursuits. And then I came across a gentleman named Eben Pagan and his work and his courses for men on dating and relationships, and they literally changed everything for me. What I learned transformed me into a leader for the first time in my life, and I can honestly say that I would not be where I am today without his influence. And as my confidence changed, my business changed, and I started to study what he was doing as an entrepreneur, literally modeling my products and my business after his, which was probably a smart decision when you consider that his companies have produced more than $100 million in revenue over the past 10 years. So today, I am fortunate enough to call him a friend and to have the opportunity to introduce him to you guys so that he can make an impact and a difference in your life. So with that being said, please welcome one of the most important mentors that I've ever had the privilege to learn from and work with, Mr. Eben Pagan. Hey everybody, Mike Dillard here, and I'd like to welcome a very good friend of mine who's had an absolutely massive impact on my life over the past 10 to 15 years, Mr. Eben Pagan. Welcome to the show, Eben.
It's great to be here, Mike.
So I'm super excited about today's episode with you because in many ways you have preceded my life by about 5 to 10 years, and I found myself following in your footsteps, as I've gone through the different various chapters in mine, and a large part of who I've become and what I've accomplished, over the past 10 years is you are directly responsible for. So I've always told people that the amount out of the amount of mentors I've had and teachers in my life, you're, I'd have to say, at the top from a literal standpoint, meaning that you've had more of a direct impact on my life and who I am today than anybody else that I've ever studied. So I have to say thank you for that, as always. And I'm really grateful that we've had the chance to become friends over the last few years, and that you're going to take the time to share your wisdom with a whole new audience today.
Yeah, thank you for the acknowledgement, Mike. I'm looking forward to it.
So what I wanted to do is really touch on a few of the big chapters that you've had in your life, which you have also really turned into opportunities to teach others and to turn into businesses as well. And I think that the guys who are listening to this out there are going to relate to at least one of them, if not all of them, depending upon where you are, at your point in your life right now. But if you could take a few minutes to walk people through, how you some of the challenges that you went through when you were younger when it came to specifically relationships and dating, and how you turned that into your first big, business success. And then I would love to talk about some of the highlights of what you've accomplished as an entrepreneur in your career as you progressed down that chapter. And then now, you're a recent father and you're married, which is something that I remember you were doubtful would ever happen for you at some point. And so how that has taken such a big 180 in your life and what you've learned from that. And I know that you've spent a ton of time over the past few years specifically studying the topic of love and marriage and relationships and fatherhood. And I'm absolutely curious to hear, the highlights of what you've taken away and applied with your family recently.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of my models, Mike, is if you see someone that is a really high performer in a particular area, it's often an overcompensation for something. And so in this conversation, if you just put that, that lens on for a second, you'll see that most of the success that I've had in my life and with relationships and things, it's really it's a reaction to having challenges earlier in my life. My background, I grew up to hippie parents out in the backwoods of Oregon, and we were very poor, and I didn't have access to people. I didn't know anyone who was successful or rich, and I really didn't even know anyone who knew anyone that was rich or successful. I didn't get taught business success. I didn't have good models for how to be successful with women and in relationships. So all these things are, skills that I picked up along the way. We can start wherever you want. You want me to talk a little bit about, the women dating thing first?
If you wouldn't mind spending 5 to 10 minutes on that, that would be great. I know there's a lot of people who are probably already familiar with your work there, but for those who aren't, specifically for the guys who out there who have not come across your work, that was finding what you did through Double Your Dating and your pen name David D'Angelo was literally one of the biggest turning points in my life. It's what allowed me to go from a place with zero confidence in myself, a very as basically a beta at that point, to an alpha leader and a place of absolute confidence. And that was a hugely defining moment in my life. And I owe you that and your work in that. And so I would absolutely love it if you spend a few minutes talking about that to give this new audience a chance to discover your work there.
Sure. Well, growing up in school, I wasn't the guy that was getting the notes, and the messages from girls. I never had a girlfriend, all through grade school and middle school and high school. I just was never comfortable around women. And later on in my late 20s, I decided that I had to do something about this. I'd had a few girlfriends, basically by accident. I met them when they were single and I was single, and we would get into a relationship. But between those relationships, I felt very insecure. And finally, I got into some business. I was doing pretty well later in my 20s. I got a good job. I moved from Oregon to California. I got a great little apartment right on the beach in La Jolla, and I got a new BMW. And I thought, okay, now I've got the apartment and the car. Now this whole thing with women is going to work out. And sure enough, I still couldn't get a date to save my life. And so I said, okay, I did all the things you're supposed to do. What's going on here? I've got to figure this out. And so I made a commitment to learn about it. And I read a bunch of books and I went to seminars and I tried, pickup lines that I read on the internet. And, I'll try anything kind of. And so ultimately, none of that stuff worked very consistently. Any of the things that were recommended at seminars and, and whatever, internet news groups and by the pickup artists, it always felt a little weird to do any of that stuff because it felt inauthentic and I don't know, it just didn't make sense. And so I started making friends with guys who were really good with women, guys that were just naturally got it. And it was a pretty motley crew of guys. I mean, one of them was a kind of an international playboy, and another one was an ex-biker and hypnotist, and another one was a stockbroker, and they were kind of all over the map. But I made probably, 5 or 6 really good friends. And I went out with them and just watched what they did as they interacted with women. And I noticed that what they were doing, was what I would just call counterintuitive. Whereas, I'd see an attractive woman and I think I should go over and give her a compliment or try to buy her a drink. They might do something like make a joke or tease her or make fun of her shoes. And, at first I cringed because I thought, you can't do that. But they were so consistently successful at getting women's phone numbers and flirting and having the women laugh and get dates. And, they were just living the life with women that I wanted to live. I said, okay, well, there's got to be something here. So I paid attention. And after a few months of really watching what they were up to, the patterns started to jump out at me. And I realized that this type of confidence that they were displaying and the way that they were approaching women and what their beliefs were about them, just totally different than I had. And through this, I had the realization that I sum up as attraction isn't a choice. And the idea here is that women aren't choosing who to feel attracted to. It's something that kind of happens automatically. Basically all animal species have a mating dance, some kind of courtship ritual that has a series of steps. One of them does this thing and the other one does this thing and then the other one does this thing. And then it kind of goes in this sequence. Well, humans have one too, and it has dozens of steps. And most men don't know what those steps are, whereas women seem to be born having the map of those steps wired into their heads. And so as a man, if you walk into a situation with an attractive woman, especially a woman that gets lots of attention from men, so she gets lots of practice, interacting with men. There's a lot of iteration and, learning how it works. If you're inexperienced and you don't have the map, you're going to make simple mistakes, just obvious mistakes to her that she sees guys making all day because 10 guys a day talk to her. If you know the map and you know how everything works and you know that attraction isn't a choice and it's not something she's choosing, then you can do the things that kind of activate the chemistry or trigger the attraction. And so I started doing that, and that worked a lot better, and allowed me to be able to go into any situation and start meeting women. And it was really interesting because before that, I never experienced myself as a man who was attractive. I mean, I'm not one of those guys that goes out and women just walk up and start talking to me. I mean, I've known a lot of those guys. I've met them and hung out with them. But, even though I'm not that guy, I realized that I had control over this, and that was super empowering. And once I learned how to, meet women, whether it be online or in person, and get dates and start getting girlfriends that were, really attractive and intelligent and interesting, I guess it sort of, it freed up a part of my consciousness in a way to do other things. I wound up writing a book about my experiences and what I learned. I wrote it using a pen name, which was David D'Angelo. And a lot of people say, why do you use a pen name? Well, my name, Eben Pagan, is just a kind of unusual name, and I wanted to have something that was a little bit more normal that guys could relate to and, be more memorable, a better marketing name. I've spent a lot of years studying marketing. So anyway, so I came up with this name. I wrote this book. I put it online and took off. It became very successful. We've sold hundreds of thousands of copies of it. And then I started creating other programs because guys just really love to learn this stuff. So I took what I had learned and I put it into teaching formats, audio programs, video programs, seminars, and it did really well. It grew into a multi-million-dollar a year business.
Well, don't be humble. let's use the real number. I want people to be able to understand the accomplishment that you've had from a business perspective, because I think that's going to be important here as the conversation continues. So if
Sure.
you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So, well, in the beginning, the first year we did $150,000 in sales, and most of that was toward the end of the year, and then the second year we did 500,000, and then we did, I think, $1.5 million, and then 5 million, and then 12 million. And at this point, we also started publishing relationship and dating courses for women, and we had other teachers come into my business and start, creating those other courses. So we were now teaching relationship and dating advice for women, and then dating advice for men. At this point, we hit about $20 million a year. And then a lot of people were asking me, my friends, how are you doing this, Eben? You're running this business from home. You're working at your computer. We never had an office. It was always 100% virtual. And so I seemed to be really living the life, and I was enjoying it. But my friends are saying, all right, what are you up to here? And so I showed them how I was creating these courses and I was teaching, and some of them started copying what I was doing and applying it to their own, universes. One of them was teaching how to plan your own wedding, and another one was teaching courses on, how to get into a top college and how to do poker. And anyway, so different people started copying what I was doing, and they started having success. And because so many people were asking me, to teach them, I thought, oh, this is another idea. This is another thing I could do. So I launched a business that did courses on marketing, business, entrepreneurship, productivity. And that business took off. And kind of at our height there, we were doing about $30 million a year in sales.
For both, or just the business side?
For the whole thing, all of them.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first wrote my first big course, on marketing 10 years ago, and I'm trying to figure out this entire process, one of the first things that I did is I actually ordered your programs, which came in binders at the time with the DVDs, and this was on the dating side because you hadn't started the business arm yet, just to model how you constructed it. What the design of the binder, the DVD, the layout of the program, who printed it, where did you get them created? Because, clearly blazing a trail of a fantastic business with fantastic quality products. And so, I have to give you props for that as well. I literally just, was modeling what you were doing for years for my stuff. So I was definitely one of those guys who was following in your footsteps there.
Send all royalties to my Miami address, please.
Yeah, it was awesome, brother. And it's interesting how the psychology that I learned from your dating programs, which is the as you nicely summed up as attraction is not a choice. It's amazing how well that applies to business and marketing and sales as well. And so that's essentially what provided the cornerstone for my first book, Magnetic Sponsoring, which was how do you use attraction psychology and attraction marketing to acquire customers and bring people to you rather than chasing them down and trying to force a sale upon them. So that was an interesting application from the dating world to the business world. And so you've got this business that has done over $100 million, let's say in the span of maybe 5 years. You've got, I believe at one time you had 50 to 80 employees, all virtual.
Yeah.
And so that has, you still do the business stuff today. I still see some courses, coming out from you maybe once a year. And so where are you right now personally from a business perspective? Are you retired? Where are you at these days?
Definitely not retired. I plan to retire when I retire permanently. Mm-hmm. So let's see, 6 years ago now, as we have this conversation, I had been teaching business for a few years, and I embarked on this new thing. I started investing in and advising technology companies, which I guess was a natural progression there. Robert Kiyosaki talks about going from employee to self-employed to business owner, and then you go to investor. And I think after that, ideally, you'd go to philanthropist and teacher. At the highest level. So I was in that groove and started doing some investing, and then I met the woman that is now my wife. And this is at a point in my life where I thought I was in my kind of later 30s and having a great life, and I just didn't think it was going to happen for me. I mean, relationships didn't seem to work out. And I was really following my own advice, just doing what I was really good at and trying to develop myself and keep growing, keep getting my message out there. I met my wife at Burning Man of all places, and
I was there at that event when y'all met.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Man, I forgot that, Mike. You were there.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a mind blower. Okay. So I met my wife there. We started dating, and when I met her, I was like, oh, great, another woman to put into the lineup kind of thing. Mm-hmm. She had other designs, and she turned out to just be really perfect for me. So we got married, and we've been now we've been married for a while. We had a little baby daughter a couple of years ago, and then in that kind of process, I realized, okay, if I'm going to have a child and a family. And there were some things that were happening in my business that were also catalysts for this, but I realized I needed another transformation because up until that point, I had been running my business as kind of the sole owner. Like it was, all mine, 100% owned by me, et cetera. And I also, through investing in companies and things, I had gotten more comfortable being partnered with other people. And I'd had bad experiences when I was younger with different people. And I hated the idea of having someone else that had control over my destiny. Well, over the years, I learned how to pick people better. I learned about personality types, and I learned to trust my intuition more. And I learned what to look for. I learned how to interview people, learned how to spot people that were high performers and intelligent and persistent, and learned how to find people that were doing it for the long term because they loved to do it rather than people who were doing it for the short term because they were just trying to, make a quick buck. And that led to me taking this company we were talking about, and I broke it into 3 pieces and essentially partnered with people who had worked with me for years building the business. And, from the way I think of it, I was very generous and gave away, big shares to these folks, majority shares, basically. The model that I'm working with right now in a lot of the things that I'm working on is me a 49% partner and the other person 51, which I'll just making that little mark because it's not intuitive. Most people would not do something like that. And we can maybe come back to that and talk about that in investing.
Yeah, I'd love to know if that includes voting rights as well.
Yeah. It includes, it's more than voting rights. I mean, I actually say to them, you make the decisions, So we can circle back to that one. But ultimately what I've done now is I've partnered with others, and these 3 businesses, we scaled them all back a bit and, set them up so that they were really lean to make sure that these new people that were running the companies, had a really good fighting chance. And so far, all of them are doing really well. Probably we're at, I don't know, I'm going to make this up. We're probably at half of the size that we used to be, but they're all successful and they all seem to be growing. And, I think ultimately this is going to be, a new chapter for me as well. And so, that freed up time and energy where I can spend more time with my wife and my little baby daughter, who is amazing. And, you're a dad now too, so you know what that's all about. It's a whole other thing in life that's really great. Anyway, I've been talking for a bit. I don't know if you want to open any of those other things up.
No, that's been great. And it's, man, there's a few questions that have popped up along the way, on these topics. When it came to finding a long-term relationship, you said that it was something that you've always struggled with. And I have a personal interest in wanting to know more about that because you and I are fundamentally wired in a very similar way, meaning that we both are INTPs, from a Myers-Briggs standpoint. And obviously my marriage did not work out successfully, so that has forced me to really go, work on that part of my life as well. And so, what was the big change for you? Was there a catalyst, a piece of information, a something that you had that was similar to, the epiphany of attraction is not a choice? Was there something similar that you discovered, from a long-term relationship standpoint?
Yeah, a few things are coming to mind. So you mentioned the Myers-Briggs type indicator there, based on Carl Jung's theory. So it's got some foundation. What I've learned about the Myers-Briggs system is if you find someone that is too different from you, it has a high probability of creating long-term conflict that is, I don't want to say impossible, but, likely to be insurmountable, or it's going to be too big of a challenge down the road. So I think what you're looking for, and I think it's important to study personality type systems to get into them a little bit. I like the Myers-Briggs system. The Enneagram system, even though it's a bit on the woo-woo side, has been very valuable to me. Some of the other systems like the Colby and the DISC, and each of them have their own lenses, their own ways of analyzing personality and thinking and decision making and behavior and so forth. And so when you get into these, and all it takes is you read a couple of books on them and you start trying to figure out which type you are and which type other people are, gives you sets of distinctions to look for so that you can realize whether or not in the long run you're going to be compatible. So for example, in the Myers-Briggs system, in Carl Jung's system, there are two functions called judgment and perception. And folks that have a lead judgment function, or what in Myers-Briggs they call judgers, these are people that like to plan things out. Right? They like to have a structure to things, and they like to make a plan and then stick to the plan. And then people who are perceivers, or who use perception as their kind of lead function, they like to keep their options open, not make decisions, and to really improvise. And these are very different ways of approaching the world. Judgers are always on time. They're usually a few minutes early. Perceivers are usually a few minutes late. They actually relate to time differently internally, the way they kind of think about it and feature it in their minds. And as you might imagine, these two types have a lot of conflict because they take it personally. When the perceiver is a few minutes late, the judger says, that's disrespectful. When the judger gets, uptight about things being decided and things being on time, perceiver takes it personally. They kind of have a little bit of a cobra mongoose kind of relationship. Well, that's the way it is with all of these different personality distinctions. And there are a lot more than, I mentioned. Neurolinguistic programming goes into a lot of different meta programs and different ways of looking at the world, what your primary interest is, how you sort things. So if you're serious about having a relationship that works, it's important to know thyself and also to know your partner. And to have these distinctions helps you to make a decision that's more sustainable. My cousin, he used to always say, being in love isn't about looking into each other's eyes, it's looking in the same direction. That's an old quote from somewhere. And if you find someone who's looking in the same direction as you, if you're looking out onto the horizon and you can see going into a life together, that's a key piece of it, and not just the physical attraction, not just the emotional drug trip that you get when you first fall in love with someone for that first year, 18 months. So that was an important one. And because I had these distinctions as I went through my various relationships, I knew that certain personality types were just more harmonious with me, and other personality types, while there might be a lot of initial attraction and a lot of like very strong chemistry, I could see that those types with me, they devolved over time, and it turned into, we would wake up after 6 months or something and just realize that we were completely different and we had nothing in common and we didn't see the world the same way. So that's a big one. And by the way, you mentioned I'm a Myers-Briggs INTP. My wife is a Myers-Briggs INFP. So we're close, but we have one difference, which is I'm a Myers-Briggs thinker, which means that I'm more dissociated, rational, coming from the head and doing things for logical reasons. And she's more of, she's a feeler. So she's a Myers-Briggs feeler. She's more emotional, in the body, doing things for the right now, in a lot of ways, just for the sensory stimulation and the learning that happens when you do things spontaneously. So, we have our differences, but we have a lot of things that we share as well. And my experience in relationships is, depending on, which type system you use, you really want to be in that kind of 50 to 75% overlap, where there's some difference. I mean, if you have the exact same personality type, that becomes uninteresting very quickly because you're the same and you can't blind spot each other, So that's one thing that I learned. Another thing, do you want me to talk a little bit about what I've learned about relationships?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely love that. And I was going to ask you if there is a book that you would recommend to people, if you could give them one, on this topic specifically,
on the personality type topic?
Sure, specifically if it's from a context of relationships.
I really like the book The Art of Speed Reading People by the Tigers. The Art of Speed Reading People. And that one's great because it's a simple introduction to the Myers-Briggs system. It's very straightforward. But they've also got this great section in the back where it gives you cheat sheets for how to speak the language of each type. And that is super fascinating because you can see the wordings and the phrasings and the way to say things so that the other person can hear you. And through words, it gives you a great lens to look at other people. Another thing, I studied dating, and my wife has studied relationships. She's actually a love coach. And if you're serious about playing the growth game, you definitely need a partner who's into the growth game. Now, a lot of people will say they're into the growth game. So you can't just say to a woman, "Hey, are you into self-development?" Because you can't say no to that. What you want to do is you want to listen for, in what ways have you developed yourself physically and around health? In what ways have you developed yourself emotionally and around relationships? And in what ways have you developed yourself intellectually and, culturally? And, are you doing this continually in different parts of your life? Because a lot of people will say that they're interested in this stuff, but they're not. They're actually in this, as my wife would say, the Fort Knox of the status quo. They're locked into doing things the same way. They've got a very strong persona, and they've just learned that it kind of impresses others when they talk about how much they like learning or growing or developing. So you have to really ask: is this person continually growing and changing? And I tend to have friends and like being around people that are what I would call growth types, or personal growth types, because if you don't talk to them for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on how close of a friend they are, every time you get back together with them, they've got some new fascinating model they've learned or new piece of data or new experience that they've had. And there's a synergistic effect, when two of these types get together. So find a woman that this is who she is, this is who she's been. And every time you get together with her, there's some new thing that she's learned, some new thing that she's doing, a new adventure she's going on, a new type of person she's built a relationship with. If that's not there, you're entering into a relationship with someone that's committed to staying the same. And changing people is hard. It's a really hard business. And, I know the drug trip is very strong at the beginning, but if you're with someone that isn't a growth type and not into changing, you're probably in for a long road.
Yeah, well, it's the equivalent of trying to drag along a dead weight at that point. Literally, the ball and chain at that point across a finish line, and that's the one big epiphany that I've had since my first marriage, is that a relationship is a very dynamic process. It's not an event. And it's something that you wake up and you work on every single day for the next, the rest of your lives, really. And you've got to have someone who can keep up with that process. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's some really valuable feedback. So, and Annie, by the way, is amazing, and she's been a huge help to me over the last, couple of months. And can't wait to have her. She's actually going to be on an upcoming episode of Self-Made Man. So I'm super excited.
Oh, cool! Yeah. I didn't know that. That's good.
Yeah. And so that will be coming soon, and we'll stick to the relationship topic and love on that episode with her. So
can I make one more comment here, Mike?
Of course.
About relationships. So when I started studying the dating stuff, I really felt like, okay, if I could just figure out this dating thing, like, I got my life handled. And then once I figured that out, it was like, okay, well, now I need to figure out money. If I can get some money and I got the dating thing, then everything's fine. But when I look back at my life, when I was in that place, what I realized was that the pursuit of money and the pursuit of women, there was a tremendous amount of unacknowledged fear and anxiety that I had, that I was just trying to, soothe, or trying to essentially, pat down, or, get out of my life, or relieve, And as I have now, I've been married, I have a family, I look at my life, and I look at the family unit, and I look at my previous life and my parents, and I look at all this stuff differently. What I really get is that most men who are anxiously looking for the next woman, or most men who are anxiously looking to make more money or get more material things, that it's really fear driven. There's like an underlying terror and an anxiety that they have that comes up, and then they go out and they do those activities of trying to meet women or trying to make money as a distraction. It's the thing that they feel like, well, if I get some money, I can get some security, or if I can get a woman and have sex, that'll, be relief. But now I kind of think of it as most of these activities are just a way of soothing our own fears, relieving our own fear of death. And when you get into a family, when you find a woman that's going to be your partner for life, and then you have a child, you have to really deal with death. You have to really think about it and look at it. And you have to consider what's going to happen to your family if something happens to you. And the circle kind of closes, the loop closes, and you can look back on your life and see, oh, okay, I see what I was doing there. Now, I don't want to get too heavy or, get off track, but ultimately, I think that paying some attention to death and studying people who have thought about death, whether it be the Buddhists or people that have written about it, and almost doing like a samurai kind of approach. The samurai legendarily would, meditate for an hour a day on death, and they would just meditate the perfect death for an hour every day. This way, when they were in battle, they had no fear of death because they had already rehearsed it 1,000 times, so they could be completely present. And, that's one of the reasons apparently why they were so fearsome, because they didn't fear death. And if you can confront it, and this isn't a process that you do in like one meditation session, this is something you do over your life. But if you confront it and you start really looking at what the source of your anxiety and your fear is, it can soothe you. And paradoxically, what happens is once you stop being an anxious, kind of nervous, fear-racked being that's trying to act cool and get success in order to overcompensate for it, you become a lot more attractive to women. You become a lot more present. And you also become a lot more attractive to money and success. And people who are really successful want to be around you. So, I just want to put that piece in because I think it's key here.
No, I absolutely have found the same to be true in my life. There was a point after 6 years of failing miserably in my first attempts at becoming an entrepreneur, where No matter what I did, it just didn't work out. I finally hit my breaking point, and I remember this moment. It was driving down I-35 in Dallas when I lived there at the time in my crappy pickup truck, barely making ends meet. And 5-6 years of failure. I've got my friends and family putting pressure on me to like, hey, why don't you just give up on that business thing and get a real job like your other friends, and not have to worry about money anymore, paying your bills. And so I finally had this little breakdown in my car on the highway, and I said, you know what? I'm going to forget about the money side of this. I'm going to stop making, that my focus, and I'm just going to change that focus to serving people and contributing and sharing whatever I have to share, even if it's here's all the ways that I failed and that I found don't work. And the moment that I had that emotional shift is when everything changed. And within 18 months, I had my first $1 million business, and that was the big moment. And on the relationship side, what you mentioned is completely true in my experience as well. As long as the more you chase after something, the further and faster it runs away. And there's a quote that always pops in my head, which there's an element of truth to it, and at the same time, I think there's a problem with it as well. But it's he or she who cares least wins. And if you take that too far, it becomes a problem. But at least in the beginning, it just means as long as you're not attached to the outcome and you're in the present, then chances are it's going to be a successful venture. And I don't know if you have any comments or feedback about that.
Yeah, there's a mathematical concept that poker players and kind of investors use. It's called expectancy, and you probably know this term. But basically, expectancy is the expected result after you go through the cycle over and over and over and over and over. So let's say you're playing poker. If you play one hand of poker and then you make the decision, you know what, I'm not winning, so I'm going to walk away from the table, you're never going to be sitting at the World Series of Poker, at the table. It's never going to happen that way. So expectancy is if I sit down and I play 50 hands of poker, what's the sum total of the result? Or, for a stock investor, if I make 100 investments and then I tally up what the results of all of them are, that's expectancy, right? The kind of the repeated trial. What most people are doing is they're making their decisions about their life on the results that they're getting from this try. So they try and it doesn't work, and they say, "Oh, that didn't work," and then they walk away. And in life, we have to transcend that. We have to go beyond whether something worked that time, and we have to start thinking in terms of probability. And we have to get comfortable betting on something, for example, that might only have a 20% chance of success, right? But we'll bet appropriately. We'll put an appropriate amount of our time, our money, our resources, our attention into it, because if it pays off, it might pay off really big. And if you're betting on things that only have a 20% chance of success, like let's say investing in companies, 1 in 5 succeeds, it allows you to keep going. It allows you to keep going and keep learning. Most entrepreneurs like you and I who are successful, they tried other things and it didn't work, and they tried something and it didn't work. But somehow they learned, whether we read, Think and Grow Rich, or, we learned from someone else, we learned that persistence pays off, and that you've got to keep going and you've got to keep doing this, because the expectancy of, quitting after one failure is you're not going to succeed. Whereas the expectancy of just dogged determination, and you keep coming back and you keep iterating and you keep applying, you keep making those bets on things that have a low probability of paying off, but that they're going to pay off big, and eventually one of them does.
The term that pops into my head when you were mentioning that is basically asymmetric, risk versus reward, which is it really become a buzzword since Tony Robbins came out with his book on money, a couple of months ago, and he discusses that. And here you are mentioning that as well. And I think that's a great transition point, actually, to talk about what you are doing now in your next or your new chapter. You've mastered relationships, you've mastered money. Now you're moving on into the investor category. And as you and I chatted about briefly before we started the show today, the topic of futurism and the incredible amount of change that is coming our way over the next 10 to 20 years, which I'm super excited to talk about, because I think about that kind of stuff all the time, and I'm really interested to hear about the conclusions that you've come to. So,
yeah, well, you mentioned investing in future, and I guess we could start off by just saying invest in things that will be more valuable in the future.
Makes sense.
Right? So invest in things that'll be more valuable in the future. Yeah, it sounds right. Kyle Bass, who has become pretty famous in the investing world over the last several years,
Yep.
a highly intelligent, guy. He said recently that, this is the hardest investing environment that he's ever seen. And one of his quotes was, I'm not focused on return on investment. I'm focused on return of investment. He's just trying to figure out, how do I preserve the capital we have and not lose it? Because of things like, if you just take let's say you got $1 million and you go put it in the bank, it's going to steadily decrease in value over time as inflation grows, and it's going to decrease in a curve, like in an exponential curve, because inflation compounds on top of inflation. And then if you try to take that money out and do something with it, as you know, Mike, you know this better than me, but you pay all these little tolls and fees and transaction costs. It's actually pretty hard to keep something at just the same value over time. And so, at this point, we have to start looking at people like Warren Buffett, and who's probably the most successful investor in history, and saying, all right, what have these investors really learned? Because in my model of wealth building, the way I teach it is, first you learn how to produce value, right? And those two words are selected carefully. It's not necessarily create, because I don't think we can, in a strict literal sense, create anything. But almost like a movie producer in Hollywood organizes the people and kind of gets them all going in the right direction and is responsible for driving the project and creating the result. But the producer doesn't create the movie; they produce it. There's a word for organizing all these elements and these resources together toward a goal. So produce, and then value, and studying value and asking yourself what value means and what it is to individuals, and particularly the types of people that are going to be your customers, or let's say a woman in your life. What is value to them? What do they seek? So that you can produce that value. And in my case, producing value in the dating advice world meant teaching men effectively how they could go out in their own lives and get dates with women, get relationships with the kinds of women that they wanted. In business, teaching people how to do marketing in a way that would get them more customers. So produce value is the first thing. And then take that value and turn it into money. Okay, so you take your value, you get it out there into the world, then money comes back to you. Then you take that money and you go invest it in assets. And Robert Kiyosaki has some great distinctions between assets and liabilities, but you go buy assets. And I would say a very specific type of asset, one that grows in value and one that throws off value. The investors would call this a productive asset. So, you don't want to go buy a car that's brand new off the lot because, yes, it's an asset, but it's going to go down in value very quickly. You may want to buy some gold. That could be an asset. In a lot of cases, it's more of a hedge. But, if gold is priced very well and you have a knowledge of gold and you really believe it's going to go up and there's a high probability that that's right, buying some gold might be one of these assets. And then you start collecting these assets. You collect several of them over time. And once you've got a basket of assets that are all going up in value over time, you achieve what I would call wealth. I could kind of rubber stamp that and say, all right, you have a group of assets, they're going up in value over time. You've figured this game out. Now, I mentioned Warren Buffett earlier. Warren Buffett brings a key piece to this equation. He says, only invest in things you understand. And I learned an important lesson with my first major investment. I was growing this business. It was doing very well. I started making money from it. I started making real money. This is probably 10 years ago. And I took my first $250,000 that I made that was, extra kind of discretionary money. And I put it into an investment with someone that was a really important person to me, someone that I really loved and kind of who was like a second father to me. And we bought a resort. We bought a little piece of land with a little resort on it, by a lake and so forth. And I'd worked in real estate in the past. I'd worked in residential real estate. I thought, okay, I'll take a look at this, take a look at what probably the business is going to look like, what the projections are. But I didn't understand, actually. I didn't understand commercial real estate. I'd never really worked with it. I didn't really know anything about the resort business or how it ran. But it seemed to be a good idea. And it turned out to, wound up being an expensive lesson. In total, it probably cost me $750,000. It was painful for me, painful for this person who I was doing it with because, he loves me very much. And I finally got out of it several years ago, and I realized, wow, this investing thing's not as easy as it first appears. I made friends with a really successful guy, kind of 100 millionaire level guy, and he once said, "It's harder to keep money than it is to make it." And I was like, no, don't tell me that. That doesn't sound good.
I found that to be true as well.
Yeah. And so anyway, I studied Warren Buffett, and I realized, okay, I understand business. That's what I've been paying attention to for the last several years. I've learned marketing. I've learned about personality types and entrepreneurs. So I started investing in businesses and advising them. And so I've either invested in or formally advised now 5 or 6 companies. And this idea of investing in things you understand, it's so critical because, first of all, I can advise the business. I can help them grow. I can help them with their challenges. If something goes wrong or something seems to be, going sideways, it's not a complete mystery to me. I can't, I don't just sit on the sidelines and say, well, I don't know what to do. I can actively jump in. So investing in things that you understand is just super critical, and investing in things that will grow in value over time, I think, is also critical. I've been yapping here for a few minutes. I'll pull over and see if there's any direction you want to go.
Well, I've learned many of the same lessons. It's had a lot of ups and downs since I jumped into the world of investing, which I would say I started in 2007 when I really started to pay attention to the economy. And my first big investment was around what I thought I understood best, above and beyond business, which happened to be precious metals. And that had really kind of caught my attention based on what I was reading, about the economy. And so I literally took 90% of my savings and I bought gold and silver in 2007, which, there's the risk-taking profile of an entrepreneur for you. And thankfully, I was very fortunate in the fact that I bought low at the time and did quite well with that. But I have also, so I've learned a couple of big things. One is that if I don't know the subject matter well when it comes to a certain investment category, then the only way around that is to then go focus on identifying the absolute best in the world when it comes to that category and giving them a check. And so a lot of my other investments have been around apartment complex and cash flow real estate, which, is a direct response of Robert Kiyosaki's work as well. And those have done very, very well for me. And it's because I have, given my money to a small family-run operation here in Austin, second-generation real estate team who's unbelievably conservative. And they know what they're doing to a T. And they know if they're going to lose money or if they're going to make money. And so it becomes a very safe investment for me in that regard. Anytime I've put money in the stock market myself, I've lost it like every single time. So I don't do that anymore. But the other big lesson that I've learned is, after having some wins and having a lot of defeats as well with money, the pattern here is repeating because of me. And so I really started to look at what drove me from a personality standpoint and a habit standpoint, and realized that with my personality type, I'm an entrepreneur, which means I'm very okay with risk. I have the ability to generate more money if I lose the money that I have invested, which just encourages me to take more risk. And then my Colby score is I'm an 8 out of 10 on the quick start, which is a very similar profile for most entrepreneurs. I'm really okay with making very fast decisions without a lot of facts or details, just doing it on an intuitive level. And if you take all of those personality traits and then you apply that to the topic or activity of investing, it can very, very quickly and often lead to disaster. And so I've had that realization, which has been huge for me. So what do you do with that information now? So the win has really come from taking myself out of the equation in every opportunity that's possible. So I either give money now to the guys who are the experts and that I trust, or I create an automated process for accumulation and savings accumulation, so I can then acquire a pool of money, or as we like to call it, a bullet fund. And then as investment opportunities come along for maybe a new apartment complex, I have the money there to go ahead and invest that. But if I don't automate that savings process, I'll find another use for that money, whether it goes into a race car or something, it disappears. And so I have to automate it, take it out of my hands, out of sight, out of mind. It goes into a different bank and a different account that I don't have a check card to, that I don't have a checkbook to. And so there's some barriers to entry to access that money. And since I've done that, that's really what has allowed me to start accumulating money and accumulating wealth for the first time in my life. So,
yeah, that's great.
I don't know if you've had.
I'll have to. I'll have to talk to you at some point about some of the real estate stuff, because I obviously had a not that great experience. But because I worked on the residential side, and at some point I need to diversify a little bit. I'd love to talk to you about that.
Yeah, the advice that I got from Tom Wheelwright, who is a very good friend of mine and Robert's CPA, is that you want to look for, you mentioned, what you look for in an asset, something that goes up in value, something that throws off cash flow. And the third quotient or feature is something that reduces your tax liabilities. And real estate fits all three of those. It's one of the few assets that does. And so that's why so many people, I guess, have been made millionaires by it. But I'd be happy to. So let's talk a little bit now about the future, because I'm a fan of Peter Diamandis, who I'm sure you know well, as also, and I'm a fan of following technology developments. And there have been a few things that have come out and that I've seen over the last couple of years and learned from Peter specifically, that have me more concerned than optimistic. And I'd love to share some of those with you, some of those observations that I've made, and get your feedback on them, because I would love to know if you're concerned by them, or where you're at. If you have this optimistic, rosy picture of the future as Peter does, with his book Abundance and Bold, where I have a bit more of a pessimistic standpoint, and I'm trying to figure out where people are going to fit into the equation 20 years from now.
Yeah, let's go.
Well, I'm gonna hand it over to you. I'm gonna hand it over to you, and let's start wherever you want.
Yeah, well, I've become, a lot more interested in futurism over the last few years, as I've realized that. So we mentioned Kyle Bass earlier. He said this is the hardest investing environment he's ever seen. It's harder to predict where things are going to go. So I've read, futurism books over the years. Things like Megatrends and, Alvin Heidi Toffler's work and so forth. And it's always interesting to me. It's always really interesting to look at where these folks are predicting the future will go. But what I started to realize was, if you go back through Megatrends and, you look at some of the things that he was talking about in there, the rise of globalism, et cetera, you realize he was right. And if you start looking at people like Alvin Toffler and Future Shock and Daniel Burrus and Technotrends, and you realize, wow, these guys were thinking about this and they were right. They saw what was coming, and most people weren't paying attention. So then it started to occur to me, okay, I need to start paying more attention to this. But even more importantly, the rate of change is increasing. Ray Kurzweil talks about the law of accelerated returns, where we've got this double exponential increase in change that's occurring, and now technology is driving this. It's almost like 20 years ago, you could kind of look out 20 years, as a lot of people did. Well, not a lot of people, as a small handful of people did, and you could see what was manifesting and what was going to happen with some clarity. Whereas now you can look out maybe 5 years or 10 years. And that's about the things where there's, good data and there are experts. But 20 years, man.
Impossible.
Say again?
I'd say 20 years seems impossible. You might as well ask what the future's going to look like in 100.
Yeah, exactly. And so in a way, our distance into the future that we can see is shortening. It's getting closer, faster. And then, behind us is all the things that we've learned and how valuable they are. And skills and knowledge, information, its sell-by date is getting shorter and shorter, like it's, getting closer and closer. So the things that, I learned 10 or 20 years ago are having less value to me as I move into this future. And so it's almost like the future is coming at me faster, and the ground behind me is crumbling as I'm kind of running into this thing. which I realize it's almost like a little bit of an anxiety provoking or kind of an alarmist picture.
Well,
But
that's exactly how I feel about it.
yeah. But I got from that like, oh, well, there are experts that have been thinking about this for quite a while now. I can go pay attention to them. And what I got was that, there's a handful, maybe 10 mainstream futurists. And these are some of the people that we've talked about, like, Daniel Burrus and John Naisbitt and Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil and so forth. And the world hasn't caught on to this. Like, the world hasn't really caught on to thinking about futurism as something that they need to learn. And I think now we all need to become futurists. Futurism is one of the skills that's no longer optional if you plan to be successful in the future. And one of the great distinctions I got was from Daniel Burrus, and he's got this distinction called hard trends and soft trends. And hard trends are things that you can predict in the future with a relatively high degree of certainty, whereas soft trends are things that you can't predict with a high degree of certainty. For example, we can probably predict that Moore's law about the number of transistors on a chip on a computer processor, for example, is going to double around every 18 to 24 months. And that's probably going to keep going for a while. No one's got a good reason why it's not going to. So we can look forward and say, okay, well, this exponential kind of growth curve, that's probably going to increase. And we can look at things like computers and memory and the kinds of capabilities that we're going to have, like artificial intelligence and virtual reality and some of the design things that allows us to do. And we can have a pretty high degree of confidence that those things are going to manifest or those are going to materialize. Whereas, for example, I don't know where the stock market's going to be in 5 or 10 years. Like, we just don't know. We can look at demographic trends and we can look at different things, but what's fascinating about the stock market is that there are too many forces to take into consideration, and oftentimes it defies what it should be doing. And as they say, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So becoming a futurist and learning about hard trends, which things you can see with some clarity, and then basing the skills that you're learning right now, the relationships that you're creating right now, the businesses, the investments, and orienting them off of what is more likely to be true in the future. Again, I don't think that this is optional because there are very, very smart, very driven people out there that are doing just this, and they're becoming extremely successful because they're doing this. And with a world that's all technologically wired and that's easier to concentrate and focus power and money in one place, if you just leave it to the world and you try to put your head down and just go about business as usual and get a job and let somebody else worry about taking the risk, they're going to get a much higher percent of the rewards, I think. So, again, I don't think it's really optional for anyone that wants to be successful in the future to study futurism.
Well, let me share a scenario with you that I think about often. And I do it from the context of, I've always come from the context that no matter what happens in the future, my job as basically a marketer or a salesman is the one thing that will always be in common is human nature. And so if I always keep that in mind, then there will always be a place for whatever company I'm building or product that I'm marketing or selling, whatever it may be. And yet that little blanket of comfort for me has started to disappear over the past year with the technology that I've started to see creep out in the news and on video demos, specifically when it comes to AI. And so there are some video clips out there if you want to type in artificial intelligence, customer service calls or things like that, where there are some companies developing AI specifically for customer service right now that have gotten so good they're indistinguishable from a real human being. They sound totally real. Their tonality, their inflection points, their pacing, their pausing, their emotions, their vocabulary, their ability to listen to you, and judge where you are in real time is being demonstrated now, even though it's still in beta. And so if you can imagine a world where, let's say 5 years from now, which I believe it will be mainstream at that point, everything you do is being tracked. Facebook knows basically everything about you. Between Facebook and Google, they know everything about you in your life. You've got an iWatch now that's tracking your biometrics and your heart rate and your temperature and things like that. You've got your phone, basically that's listening to you all the time, whether you want it to or not. And you've got an AI system that can take all of this information about you in real time and tell you what kind of mood you're in, if you're pissed off, if you're happy, whatever it may be. And from a business standpoint, a business's job is to sell their products or services and to generate revenue. And so for me and you as a marketer, our skill set that has paid the bills has been our ability to persuasively communicate our ideas and persuasively sell our products and services out there to our customer base. And so what happens when 5 years from now an AI system can do that in real time infinitely more effective than you and I, meaning that it could, maybe a phone call calls up and it's Sally, who's an AI system, and Sally can try and sell you something, and she can get in real time feedback about how you're feeling about the conversation or the product or the sales pitch, whatever it may be, based on your tonality on the phone and what you're saying. And she knows that you have a sister or brother or all of your family details, or that you paid so much in taxes last year, or that you got fired, or you just got a raise. And she basically has psychic ability at that point to then become the perfect salesperson. There's no way around her ability at that standpoint. And that makes, someone like yourself or me irrelevant, because we can't keep up with a computer in real time who knows everything about everyone. And so, that's kind of a scenario where I've started to see the evidence that that's going to be real. It's already in beta. They're already working on it. And as these things become more streamlined and integrated, 5 years from now, when your fridge talks to your TV, which talks to, every other part of your life, what happens at that point?
Well, Werner Vinge calls it the singularity, right? When technology, when there exists technology that's beyond human intelligence and that can also iterate and improve itself.
Right.
Now that's, Ray Kurzweil puts that out, from here, 20 or 25 years or something like that. It's not that far. I don't know. I think about this a lot, and I talk to friends about this a lot. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think there's really much anyone's going to do about it. The Unabomber tried to get us to shut down all the technology, and what he didn't work out that well. And he was obviously a little disturbed and antisocial, but he also, I think when you look at what he had to say, there was like a deep fear in him of what's coming, and then that led him to this kind of psychotic behavior. So some people are very pessimistic about this, and they're trying to shut it all down. And some people on the other end of the extreme, like maybe Ray Kurzweil, for example, are very techno-optimist. Basically everything Ray talks about is utopian in a way, and Peter Diamandis as well. So I think you got to pick which side of that equation that you're on to get yourself kind of unfrozen.
Right.
For me, I call myself a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist, meaning in the short run, I don't think that something that I'm working on has a high likelihood of working out. But in the long run, I think that if I stay persistent and keep learning and adapting and growing, that I will succeed, and I will grow. And so I look at the way that life has been, anti-fragile, we can call it here, and how it's always made it. As he said in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And this is with, every 100 million years or so, some asteroid crashes into the planet and kills 80% of the species, essentially immediately. And then, we have to go. I was just interviewing a futurist, Alex Lightman, recently, and he said, this 50 or 60,000 years ago, the genetic record shows that the human race was reduced to a couple of thousand individuals. Like we almost didn't make it, but we made it. And so I tend to be optimistic in the long term. I think, life is going to make it. And over time, we are becoming less violent. the average tide is going up. Everyone's becoming more successful, living longer, et cetera, et cetera. So I adopt kind of an optimist outlook there. And then it's about controlling the variables that we can control. So for me, I like hanging out with people that are thinking about these things and talking about them and paying attention to, so the singularity we mentioned, there's something called the Singularity Summit. And I've gone for years. Since I had my little daughter, I haven't gone in a few years, but I'll be going again in the future. This is where a lot of these people who are thinking about the future and who are creating it hang out. The people that are doing the AI experiments and they're building the virtual realities and the robots and so forth. So go hang out with these people. Go to Silicon Valley regularly and build a network there and start getting to know people who are working on these things or are one or two people away from working on these things who can look through these lenses and see. I think it's important to spend time around young entrepreneurs and even emerging artists, people that have other ways of looking at this and other ways of seeing. I also think it's important, just brainstorming how to approach this, problem, this Rubik's Cube you've kind of put here. I think it's important to seek out high potential young people, right? People that are intelligent and driven and talented, but who haven't found their break yet, and help them to find their gifts and help them to actualize them in the world. Because down the road, if you can recognize them before other people, if you get really good at understanding what high potential looks like, and you get good at managing your own envy and your own ego so that you can help people go beyond you, in their various areas, you're then hooked up to a network of winners. You've got people leading the way into the future, and you can be tapped into them. And these things have all been extremely valuable to me as I've grappled with and wrestled with, what happens in the future when you've got, they're predicting now, and I'm saying they, meaning, some smart people that I've read about online, but they're saying that, in the next 10 to 20 years, half of everything that we do right now could just be automated and outsourced to computers.
Right.
You see it. We've got self-driving cars. We just have the first self-driving semi-truck go on the road. I mean, that's got to be sending.
Well, our kids, there's a very, very, very small chance that they will actually ever, go to driving school and get a license.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that's 12 years away. And, and one of the things that I think about as well is, we grew up, we're around the same age, and we grew up with the ability to crack open the computer case of a 286 or a 386 and get in there and play with the chips and the motherboards and make our own little computer, like building blocks, if you will. And we could see the technology and we could see how it worked and we could physically interact with it. And we've also had the same ability when it comes to online marketing. We had the ability to go out and, create a new technique or set up our own AdWords campaigns and marketing campaigns and things like that. And 10 years from now, one of my fears is, with Chase specifically, is that the technology is going to be so advanced and so invisible that the opportunity for him as a teenager to discover that technology, see how it works, and invent something on his own, becomes almost slim to none. Where he's not going to be in there. The ability to understand how a HoloLens works or AI it's so advanced that you don't have the opportunity necessarily to tinker with it. You may have the opportunity to tinker with a toolbox or a platform that Google provides for you to make your own app, if you will, or something like that. But the power is going to be so concentrated at these upper echelons of experience, technology, and knowledge that I wonder if it's going to be possible for people who aren't on that track to break into that, as we have as entrepreneurs. Because again, for the most of the cases, you're not even able to see it anymore. It's just going to work, and you're going to take it for granted. I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, magic. I'm thinking about it a lot. In fact, I fully intend that our daughter will learn about hardware and software and design, to the extent that she can, even if that's not what she wants to do. Because I don't think that in the future you're going to be able to successfully interact with other people, and in a way that creates value, unless you know how to do that. I said creates value. I mean produces value. Yeah. Some people. So in evolutionary theory, Darwin said that it's about adaptation and selection. Now, most of the time, if you're a man, you're probably talking to other men about this, and so we only focus on the adaptation part. But it's also about selection, making the right selections, and being selected yourself. So being really attractive yourself, and recognizing the traits in others that make for a good long-term, partner or investment, etc. So spotting people that are really good at adaptation and learning, and then people that are really good at selection and being selected, people that are really good at systems and systems thinking, people that are great at this survival and reproduction game, and going to a meta level with it. I think that's also critical. You want to put yourself in the presence of those people physically. You want to be around them as much as you can, because that then rubs off on you. We become who we surround ourselves with. And I think if you do that, if you run with the people that are thinking about this and who are surviving and thriving into this coming future, I think that you at least increase your probability dramatically that you will be able to adapt to it and thrive in it yourself.
Man, infinitely interesting topic. It's the possibilities are endless. The rewards are just as great as the risks, and whether we like it or not, it's coming at us faster than most people can comprehend. It's just it's really cool. Well, I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk about so many different topics today. This was an amazing call. I can't believe the gambit of or the spectrum of topics that we got to cover today. And I know we've gone over our hour here quite a bit. So Eben, thank you so much for your time today and your constant contribution to people like myself. And what do you have coming out in the near future? Is there anything that you'd like to share, with the audience, either a new business, a product, a book, a website? What's going on that's awesome and coming down the pipe for you?
Lately, I've been working on this futurism thing a lot. I've got 2 projects that I'm doing. One of them where I've been interviewing futurists, and that'll start coming out soon as a, kind of some free content. And also another project where we're starting to track the key trends and the key areas that we see being important into the future, and just watching the developments there. And so we're building a site to do that as well. So you can just kind of keep your eye out for them. And, if you're on one of our lists or something, you can watch, and I'll make sure and announce them. But those are coming in the next several months. Is
there somewhere people should go now to get on your general list so they will get those announcements from you?
Yeah, just go to ebenpagan.com.
Okay.
And you'll find something there that'll allow you to get on our list.
Perfect. Well, Eben, thank you so much for your time today and for your contribution to this project. Unbelievably grateful. And as always, man, I love talking to you and learning from you. And this has been just a fantastic session.
Yeah, great talking to you too, Mike.